The Christmas dinner at my family's house was not the warm, perfect scene you'd find on a Hallmark card. It was stiff, formal, and dripping with tension. A suffocating atmosphere where everyone was just waiting for something ugly to happen. The dining room table, long enough to seat a football team, was decorated with the best china, towering candles, and a centerpiece my stepmother likely spent half the week bragging about. The rich aroma of roasted turkey and honey, glazed ham filled the air, but my stomach was tied in knots. I knew this was not going to be a peaceful dinner. I sat halfway down the table, dressed in my military service uniform, a deliberate act of defiance. It wasn't an accident. I knew it would irritate my father, Thomas Sinclair. He had never hidden the fact that he thought my military career was a colossal waste of potential. He believed I should have joined the family business empire, the Sinclair Group, instead of wasting years playing soldier, as he so often called it. I could feel his eyes drilling into me, even as he strained to keep a fake smile for the relatives sitting nearby. The conversations at the table were shallow, a series of polite evasions and thinly veiled boasts. My brother Daniel was bragging about his new consulting firm. My other brother Kyle was showing off a new, limited edition Rolex, making sure everyone knew its value. My sister, Brooke, played the role of the family angel, complimenting outfits while pretending she hadn't signed off on fraudulent financial statements for our father's companies. I kept my head down, cutting into my turkey, when the unmistakable sound of a fork hitting a glass rang out. Dad stood up, commanding the room like a general, his voice sharp and carrying down the entire length of the table. "I have something to say," he announced, his eyes sweeping over each face before landing squarely on me. "As of tonight, I am making it clear to everyone here Ava is no longer a part of this family." The words didn't just hang in the air, they slammed down like a judge's gavel. The room went dead silent. For a second, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Brooke's fork dropped onto her plate. Kyle smirked as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Daniel cleared his throat, pretending to be shocked but not lifting a finger to intervene. My father, Thomas Sinclair, never one for subtlety, continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "She has chosen her path. She has turned her back on us, and so we turn our backs on her. From this night forward, she is no daughter of mine." It was the kind of dramatic, public humiliation he loved to pull off. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. The relatives whispered nervously. My cousin stared at me with wide eyes, as if watching a car crash she couldn't look away from. Then, slowly, I reached into the inner pocket of my service uniform jacket. The soft rustle of paper sliding against fabric felt deafening in the silence. I pulled out a single, plain, white envelope, sealed and unassuming. I placed it on the polished oak table and slid it towards my father. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said evenly, my voice calm and steady. "This is my gift to you." The entire room shifted. Chairs creaked. Daniel frowned. Kyle leaned forward like a child at a magic show. Brooke whispered, "What is that?" My father glared at the envelope but did not touch it. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice already rising. I folded my hands in my lap and looked him dead in the eye. "Open it and find out." For a man who thrived on control, this was the one thing he didn't see coming. His face twitched, his jaw clenched, and for once in his life, he didn't have the script. He reached for the envelope, his thick fingers curling around the paper as if he expected it to explode. He tore at the seal with a flick of his hand, impatience written all over him. The moment he looked inside, his face changed. The color drained from it, then flushed a deep, angry red so fast it was like watching a storm roll in. The veins on his neck bulged, and he slammed the envelope back on the table so hard the glasses rattled. "Where did you get this?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the dining room walls. The rest of the family stared, frozen between fear and curiosity. I stayed calm. My fork still sat neatly by my plate, untouched since I laid the envelope down. I did not raise my voice. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, steady as ever. The room wasn't about Christmas anymore. It wasn't about family, food, or carols. The entire night shifted into something raw and dangerous, with every eye locked on my father and me. My father's hand was still shaking as he slammed the envelope shut, but his eyes never left mine. That glare had followed me for as long as I could remember. It was the same look that told me I would never measure up, no matter what I did. Growing up, the Sinclair name meant power and money in our town. Everyone wanted Thomas Sinclair's approval. Everyone except me. I learned early that no matter how well I did in school or how many trophies I brought home, my father's reaction was always the same: a nod if I was lucky, a lecture if I wasn't. My brothers, Daniel and Kyle, were praised without measure, and my sister, Brooke, was the perfect one. I was the one who never quite fit the mold. The one to be married off or kept quiet. The boys would inherit the power. Brooke would play her part in keeping the family's image polished. And I was expected to smile, nod, and not ask too many questions. But asking questions was the one thing I couldn't stop doing. I asked why he spent so much time at work, but never explained what that work was. I asked why certain people showed up at the house with envelopes of cash. He'd shut me down every time with the same line: "You wouldn't understand. Leave it to the men." I remember the exact night the real crack in our relationship started. I was 16, and Daniel was bragging about getting into an Ivy League school with help from Dad's connections. I had worked my tail off for my grades, pulled all-nighters, studied harder than anyone I knew. When I asked if I could apply to West Point, my father laughed so hard he nearly choked on his scotch. "The Army," he said. "That's for people who don't have a future. You're not throwing your life away like that." That was the first time I looked him in the eye and said, "Watch me?" He thought it was a phase, some kind of teenage rebellion. But the more he tried to block me, the more determined I became. I joined every leadership program, every athletic team I could. My guidance counselor told me my application was one of the strongest they'd ever seen. When I finally got the acceptance letter, I felt like I had cracked open a cage he had kept me in my whole life. That night I told him. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't even fake a smile. He slammed his glass down and said, "Do you have any idea what a disgrace this is? People will think I failed as a father. No Sinclair joins the Army. Do you hear me?" No one. I packed my bags anyway. Training at West Point was brutal, but every blister, every early morning run, every moment I thought I might collapse only fueled me more. Every time I was about to give up, I heard his voice in my head calling me a failure, and I pushed harder. By the time I graduated, I wasn't just surviving, I was excelling. But that didn't mean the shadow of my family went away. At every holiday visit, it was the same story. Daniel climbing the corporate ladder with Dad's help. Kyle living like a spoiled prince off family money. Brooke keeping the family charities squeaky clean for the press. And me, I'd show up in my uniform, proud of what I'd earned, and he'd cut me down. He'd make snide comments like, "At least you get free meals in the Army." I got used to the whispers. Relatives would pull me aside and say, "Your father doesn't mean it. Deep down, he's proud of you." But that wasn't true. He was furious that I had built an identity he couldn't control. Looking back, I think he always knew I'd be the one to challenge him. He could see it in the way I carried myself, the way I refused to play along with his charade. He hated that I had inherited his stubbornness, but without his corruption. To him, loyalty meant silence. To me, loyalty meant telling the truth, even when it hurt. By the time I was in my late 20s, the divide between us wasn't just personal, it was public. Family gatherings became a stage for his insults, and I refused to back down. That war didn't just stay at the dinner table. It followed me everywhere, even when I was stationed thousands of miles away. But what he never understood was that every rejection, Every attempt to push me out only hardened me. The girl he thought would roll over became the woman who knew how to fight. The first time I stood on stage in uniform with a medal pinned to my chest, the applause from my peers drowned out every bitter word my father had ever thrown at me. The lights were hot. The hall was packed, and my commanding officer shook my hand with genuine pride. It wasn't charity. It wasn't because of a last name. It was because I had earned it. From the outside, my military career looked like something out of a recruiting poster. I wasn't just a soldier. I was the one people called when things got complicated. I ran operations that made the evening news without my name ever being attached. But back home, none of that mattered. My father brushed off every accomplishment like it was a hobby. When I was promoted, he said, "So what? You've just found a way to waste more of your time." When I earned a commendation for leading a mission that stopped a shipment of illegal weapons, he sneered. Funny how you fight crime overseas when you can't even respect your own family. He couldn't stand not being in control of the narrative. He could tell his friends that Daniel was a business genius, that Kyle was a master of negotiation, and that Brooke was a saintly philanthropist. But me? I was the one story he couldn't rewrite, the one success he couldn't spin as his own, and it burned him alive. I learned to stop expecting anything from him. Instead, I let the army become my home. My fellow soldiers were more of a family than the one I had been born into. They cared if you could do the job, if you had their back when it mattered. And I always did. One mission in particular stands out, not because it was the most dangerous, but because it showed me just how far I had come. We were deployed to a region plagued by corruption, where a contractor had been exploiting the locals. My team and I uncovered financial records that exposed an entire network of fraud and theft. It wasn't glamorous work. Long nights staring at spreadsheets and intelligence reports, but it mattered. My work in military intelligence had trained me for this, spotting patterns in financial records that others missed. When the brass recognized me for leading that effort, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about missions anymore. It was about accountability. It was about calling out corruption, even when it hid behind polished suits and expensive smiles. That hit closer to home than I wanted to admit, because every time I read about shady companies, shell corporations, or bribes disguised as donations, I saw my father's world reflected in it. Still, I wasn't ready to connect those dots fully. Not yet. At that point, I just knew that my fight in the military was bigger than me, bigger than proving my father wrong. It was about doing the work no one else wanted to do, standing where others backed down. But if I'm honest, there was always that part of me that wanted him to see me just once. I wanted him to say, "That's my daughter." Instead, he'd dismiss my accomplishments as sensationalized nonsense. Brooke once told me in private, "He's never going to admit it, Ava. He'll never give you what you want." She wasn't wrong. I stopped looking for it, but I never stopped noticing the way he denied me. During one leave, I came home for Thanksgiving. The house was dripping with wealth. Crystal glasses, imported wines, servants hovering at the edges. My father introduced Daniel to a room full of investors as the future of the Sinclair legacy. He bragged about Kyle's international ventures. When it came to me, he raised his glass and said, "And here's Ava, who decided playing soldier was more fun than making real money." The room laughed, some politely, some nervously. My face didn't show it, but inside it lit a fire, not shame, not sadness, but pure anger. Anger at the idea that serving my country was somehow less than scamming people for profit. Anger that he could belittle years of sacrifice with a single cheap joke. That anger became fuel. If he wanted me to be the outsider, fine. I'd be the one who stood apart. And that clarity would come in handy. Because the deeper I went in my military career, the more I realized corruption wasn't just something happening in faraway countries. Sometimes it was right under your nose. A few months later, I was going through routine intelligence reports when something caught my eye. At first, It was just a name buried in a list of contractors flagged for suspicious activity. Vantage Horizons, a private logistics company. On paper, nothing unusual. But the moment I saw the signature on one of the filings, my stomach turned. It was mine. My name, Ava Sinclair, was listed as a consultant of record. I thought it had to be a mistake. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got. There were multiple documents tying me to the company. Authorization forms, background checks, even a forged resume. This wasn't random identity theft. This was personal. Someone had fabricated an entire paper trail linking me to a business I'd never heard of. They used real details from my life, my service record, my deployments, even my old addresses. I started pulling every string I could. I requested records, followed money trails, and connected the dots late into the night. What I uncovered looked like a spiderweb of shell companies, all tied back to Vantage Horizons. Millions of dollars were moving in circles. Contracts were padded with inflated costs, and kickbacks were hidden in consulting fees. And sitting right in the middle of that web was my father. The first piece of hard evidence came in the form of an email chain leaked through a source. In it, Daniel bragged about how convenient it was to have Ava listed on the company roster. He said it gave the business military credibility and smoothed over questions from regulators. My brothers were in on it. My name was a shield, a brand they could exploit while I was halfway around the world risking my life. That was the moment the air left the room. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. Because betrayal doesn't land all at once. It creeps in. It makes you question if maybe you misread everything. But there wasn't a misunderstanding. The documents were real, the signatures forged, the benefits clear. I thought about calling my father, but what would he say? You should be grateful your name was useful for something. I could already hear his dismissive laugh, so instead I kept digging. Every night after my duties were done, I pored over files, piecing together just how deep this scam went. It wasn't just shady, it was illegal. And through it all I kept seeing my name. Consultant Ava Sinclair, authorized by Ava Sinclair. Every forged line was another punch to the gut. They weren't just stealing money. They were hijacking my identity, my career, the integrity I had bled for. They underestimated me the way they always had. The next time I went home on leave, I watched everything with new eyes. The way Daniel bragged about deals he couldn't explain. The way Kyle dodged questions about his ventures overseas. The way Brooks smiled too tightly at charity events. None of it was random. They were all part of it. At Christmas that year, I caught Daniel on the phone in my father's study. His voice was low and urgent. When he saw me, he froze. I didn't say a word, but I didn't have to. He knew I knew. And the way he looked at me wasn't brotherly anymore. It was wary, like I was a threat. That was the first time it truly sank in. My family wasn't just corrupt. They were willing to burn anyone, even me, if it kept the Sinclair name untouchable. The war I had been fighting wasn't about words at a dinner table. It was about survival. It was about truth. And I was the only one willing to face it head on. By the time I got back to base, I had no doubt. If I pulled harder on this thread, the whole damn fabric of my family's empire would unravel. And I wasn't about to stop pulling. I started where any soldier would by mapping the terrain. Every shell company, every fake consultant, every charity that looked a little too polished, I laid them out like targets on a board. Vantage Horizons was the centerpiece, but it wasn't alone. Attached to it were at least 6 other companies with vague names: Horizon Logistics, Apex Global, Sinclair Strategic, West Bridge Imports. They shared addresses, accountants, and in some cases, even the same phone numbers. It was the kind of sloppy arrogance that only happens when people think they're untouchable. What stood out wasn't just the money flow, it was who benefited. Daniel pulled in profits through management fees. Kyle siphoned off cash through fake real estate projects. And Brooks' charities cleaned it all, turning dirty money into gleaming donations that bought her a reputation as some kind of saint. And at the top, of course, was my father. Every decision traced back to him. This wasn't a business, it was a machine. My family had built an entire shadow empire, feeding off government contracts, exploiting loopholes, and laundering tens of millions under the cover of respectability. It was the kind of operation that could only exist if no one asked questions. And no one ever did, because who would suspect the Sinclairs? We were the upstanding family in the community, the ones hosting galas, donating to veterans groups, cutting ribbons at hospitals. They used my military service like a prop in their playbook, proof that the family was patriotic, trustworthy, above suspicion. That realization cut deeper than anything else. Every time I risked my life overseas, every time I wore the uniform with pride, my own family was cashing in on that image. They didn't just steal my name, they weaponized my integrity. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself, but going public without hard evidence would get me dismissed as bitter or delusional. So I gathered everything I could: contracts, tax filings, emails. I made copies, logged timestamps, and built a case piece by piece. In the military, precision saves lives. Here it was going to save the truth. The hardest part wasn't the evidence. It was the weight of knowing that the people tied to me by blood were capable of this. Every page I turned made the house I grew up in feel less like a home and more like a crime scene. The funny thing about corruption is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. A stray comment, a late-night phone call, a sudden trip overseas. Suddenly it all looked suspicious. And I realized my family wasn't just greedy. They were reckless because they thought the Sinclair name protected them like armor. But that armor had to crack me. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the line between soldier and daughter blur. In the army, my duty was to expose threats, dismantle networks, and protect the mission. At home, my family had become that mission. And if I didn't act, no one would. Still, a part of me wanted to believe there was a limit, a point where my father would stop. But every document I uncovered told me the same thing: there were no limits. And the truth was, I wasn't just fighting corruption anymore. I was fighting for the right to own my own name, my own honor, my own damn life. The night I finished connecting the last piece of that network, I sat staring at the wall in my quarters. The evidence was spread across my desk like a battlefield map. On one side was loyalty to the uniform, the oath I had sworn. On the other side was blood. The people who had raised me, mocked me, and now betrayed me. My pulse wouldn't settle. There was no easy choice here. In the army, you don't hesitate when a threat appears, you act. But this wasn't a faceless enemy halfway around the globe. This was my family. The weight built up until I couldn't ignore it anymore. So, I did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I drove back to the Sinclair estate without warning. The house was as polished as ever, with its marble entry and chandeliers glowing like nothing in the world could touch it. But walking through those doors, all I saw was rot covered in gold leaf. I found my father in his study, cigar smoke curling in the air. His tone was smug as always. "Ava," he said, as if acknowledging a servant rather than a daughter. I set a folder on his desk. Not all of it, just enough to make the point. He didn't even look surprised. "You should have gone into business," he said, puffing on his cigar. "You've got the instincts for it." I snapped back. "This isn't business. It's fraud. It's criminal." That's when he laughed, low and sharp. "Criminal, Ava? This is survival. You think your army paycheck makes you noble? Look around. The world runs on deals like these. You're just too stubborn to admit it." For a second, I almost faltered, because he said it with such certainty, as if morality was just a fairy tale for suckers. "You used me," I told him. "You forged my name." He didn't deny it, he just blew smoke and said, "You were always going to be useful somehow. Consider it your contribution to the family legacy." That line cut deeper than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it confirmed what I already knew. In his eyes, I had never been a person. I was a tool. I walked out before I lost control. But that conversation stuck with me. Back at base, I replayed it 100 times. My father had drawn his line. He would never change, which left me staring at mine. That's when the real battle began. The one inside me. Report them and I'd be the soldier who exposed corruption, living up to everything I swore to protect. Stay silent and I'd be the daughter who let blood outweigh justice, becoming exactly what my father wanted, complicit. The conflict bled into every part of me. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I snapped at teammates. How could I explain that my enemy wore my last name? What made it worse was that I started noticing the overlap between my missions and my family's operations. Some of the regions we investigated for smuggling and fraud matched places where Sinclair's subsidiaries operated. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. My family wasn't dabbling in shady business. They were feeding off the very conflicts I was risking my life to stop. That realization crushed whatever loyalty I had left. But still, there was hesitation, because once you cross that line, there's no going back. One evening, I sat on my bunk with the case file in my lap. I thought about the soldiers who trusted me, the civilians caught in the crossfire, the oath I swore under the flag. And then I thought about the dinner tables where I was laughed at, the forged documents, the way my father called fraud survival. The choice was brutal, but it was clear. My duty wasn't to the Sinclairs, it was to something bigger. It was to the truth. That clarity didn't erase the pain. It just gave me direction. From that moment, I stopped being torn. I knew where I stood. And the moment I stepped onto that path, I also knew there was no way to come out clean. Because exposing them wouldn't just ruin the family. It would burn every bridge back to the life I had known. And if that was the cost, I had to be ready to pay it. I slid the file across the desk of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division office, my palms damp but steady. That was the moment I crossed the line from daughter to whistleblower. I wasn't bringing gossip or suspicions. I brought contracts, signatures, bank wires, the kind of evidence that spoke louder than any family name ever could. The officer on the other side barely blinked as he flipped through page after page, but I caught the subtle raise of his brow. He knew this wasn't small-time fraud. Filing that report felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I understood exactly what it meant. My family was about to become a target of the very system they'd been gaming for years. Liberating because for the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. The investigation didn't launch overnight. Bureaucracy never moves fast. But I could feel the gears turning. Subtle things started happening. Quiet interviews. Auditors showing up to review procedures. Unannounced checks on supply contractors. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of groundwork you only notice if you know what to look for. And I knew. Back home, the Sinclairs weren't blind. They could sense pressure building, even if they didn't know yet where it was coming from. I heard about frantic meetings at the estate, lawyers being called at odd hours, Daniel canceling trips. I even caught wind of Brooke throwing a fit because one of her charities got flagged for financial irregularities. But the beauty of it was that they didn't know it was me. Not yet. To them, it must have felt like the walls were closing in, random and unexplained. Still, taking the first strike didn't mean I was safe. Far from it. Rumors started swirling through the family. Little comments that made their way back to me. Daniel asking, "Do you think Ava suspects anything?" My father muttering about leaks. They were paranoid now, and paranoia makes dangerous people reckless. I felt it firsthand during a dinner I reluctantly attended. The table was set like nothing was wrong, but the tension was thicker than the oak it sat on. My father's questions were too sharp, Daniel's eyes too watchful, Brooke's smile too forced. At one point, Kyle leaned over and whispered, "You're awfully quiet, Ava. Almost like you know something." His grin didn't reach his eyes. I deflected, but inside, adrenaline shot through me. They were testing me, probing for cracks. And I knew if I gave even a hint, they'd close ranks fast. Back at base, I doubled down. Every spare moment I had went into feeding the investigators more threads. Contracts I had missed before, names of accountants, travel records. I didn't just hand them the network. I drew the map step by step so they couldn't miss the connections. One night, After sending another batch of documents through secure channels, I sat staring at the screen, thinking about how far this had gone. My father always preached about power, how it was about controlling the narrative, shaping what people believed. But for the first time, the narrative was out of his hands, and I was the one who had forced it loose. The first real blow landed when one of Brooke's charities was officially suspended, pending review. She went from a glowing socialite to a cornered animal overnight. Daniel scrambled to distance himself. Kyle tried to act casual, but word spread that his investors were pulling out left and right. And my father, he didn't flinch in public. He still walked into boardrooms with his chin high. Still held court at dinners with that same smug authority. But behind closed doors I knew he was feeling it. Because men like him don't rage when the first cracks show. They calculate. They try to figure out who betrayed them. That's what made every call from home dangerous. My phone would light up with his number, and I'd stare at it, debating whether to answer. Sometimes I did. And when I heard his voice, calm but colder than usual, I felt like prey being studied by a hunter. "Ava," he'd say, "you hear anything about what's going on?" Always casual, but always pressing. And each time I'd lie, "No idea, Dad. Must be some audit mix-up." And each time he'd pause, just long enough to let me know he didn't believe me. The thing about the first strike is it changes the rules. Before, I was just a suspicion. Now, I was an active player in a war my family didn't even realize they were fighting against me. The first threat didn't come in the form of words. It came as silence. My calls home stopped being casual check-ins. Instead, every time I answered, there was a pause. Too long, a wait behind each question. Like they were probing for weaknesses. It didn't take long before the threats grew bolder. One night, I left the base gym after a late workout and found a black SUV idling across the street. The windows were tinted, no plates visible. It didn't move when I walked by. It just sat there, engine humming. I didn't need to guess who sent it. The pressure became constant. My father's voice hardened with each phone call. "You don't understand how dangerous curiosity can be," he said once, his tone flat. "There are people who don't forgive mistakes." He didn't say our family, he said people. The kind of distancing that told me he wasn't just warning me, he was threatening me. Daniel, on the other hand, tried another tactic. He showed up unannounced at my apartment off base, carrying 2 coffees like he was just dropping by for a sibling chat. He played the role of peacemaker. "Look, Ava, you're making waves where you don't need to. Dad's old school, yeah, but he's not trying to hurt you. Just let it go. You're not going to win against this machine." I watched him carefully. He wasn't there to warn me. He was there to measure me, to see if I'd break. When I didn't give him the answer he wanted, he set the coffees down untouched and muttered, "Don't say I didn't try." Kyle was less subtle. He cornered me at a family gathering, his voice low but venomous. "You think your army badge makes you untouchable? That uniform won't protect you forever." Brooke, though, cut deepest. She didn't threaten me, she begged. She called in tears, saying the scrutiny on her charities was destroying everything she'd built. "Ava, please, you don't know what this is doing to me." Her crocodile tears weren't mine to carry. She signed off on fake expenses. She played her part. The escalation didn't stop at words and warnings. One night, my car tires were slashed outside my building. Another time, I returned from a training exercise to find my place broken into. Not ransacked, not robbed, but rearranged. Papers stacked differently, a drawer half open, just enough to let me know someone had been there. A message. "We can reach you anytime we want." I knew the Sinclairs had money, reach, and a complete lack of conscience. Harassment was just another line item on their expense sheet. What they didn't expect, though, was that every threat, every attempt to break me, only sharpened my resolve. If they were this desperate to silence me, it meant the investigation was hitting harder than they admitted. I wasn't a kid at their table anymore. I was a soldier who'd faced worse than shadows in the dark. The final straw came when my commanding officer called me into his office with a stack of anonymous complaints. They accused me of misconduct, skimming from budgets, falsifying reports, abusing authority. All fabricated, but each one detailed enough to look real. My father's playbook again: attack credibility first. Destroy the witness before the evidence lands. My CO slid the folder across the desk and looked at me carefully. "I don't buy this," he said, "but I need you to understand something. Someone out there is playing for keeps. They're not just protecting money. They're protecting survival." That was when it clicked. My family wasn't simply corrupt. They were cornered. They knew the investigation wasn't a nuisance anymore. It was lethal. And desperate people, especially ones with endless resources, don't just defend. They lash out. I left his office with my jaw tight, my fists clenched. I wasn't naive. I knew the storm was just beginning. But standing in that hallway, I also knew I'd reached the point of no return. They could slash my tires. They could stalk me, smear me, even beg me. But they couldn't erase the truth. And the more they tried to bury it, the more determined I became to drag it into the light. The escalation came faster than I expected. That weekend, my father summoned me to the Sinclair estate under the guise of a family dinner. Against my better judgment, I went, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to see their eyes, to measure exactly how desperate they'd become. The moment I walked into the house, I knew it wasn't dinner, it was an ambush. Daniel was already at the bar, swirling a drink with that smug half-smile. Brooke sat stiffly on the couch, eyes red from crying, but her makeup was flawless. Kyle paced near the fireplace, restless, jaw tight. And my father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, waiting like a judge about to deliver a sentence. No one touched the food. Plates sat untouched, wine sweating in glasses. "Sit," my father said, his voice calm, deliberate. I didn't sit. I stood across from him, hands steady at my sides. He leaned forward, folding his fingers. "You've caused us trouble, Ava. Trouble that didn't need to exist. I raised you better than this." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "You raised me to shut up while you stole." Sorry if I missed that lesson. Daniel's glass clinked as he set it down too hard. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're not just poking at Dad. You're poking at every person tied to this family. People who don't take kindly to exposure. People like you," I shot back. Brooke broke in, her voice trembling. "Iva, please? You don't understand. This family has built everything we have over decades. You think tearing it down will make you happy. You think the army will protect you when you're the reason your family collapses." Kyle slammed his palm on the table. "Enough. She doesn't care about us. She's drunk on her damn uniform, thinks it makes her untouchable. But I promise you, Iva, we can make life very short for people who cross us." That was the moment my father raised his hand and silenced them all. He looked at me, eyes dark, voice low but cutting. "You have one chance, Ava. Stop whatever you've started, drop it. Walk away, and this family will forgive. Continue, and you're not a Sinclair anymore. You'll be nothing." The words hung in the air, heavier than any slap could have been. "Then I guess I'm nothing," I said. The silence that followed was colder than the marble floors under my boots. My father leaned back, his face a mask of calm fury. Daniel muttered a curse under his breath. Brooke buried her face in her hands. Kyle looked like he wanted to lunge at me right then. That night I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't stay. I turned and walked out of the Sinclair estate with every set of eyes drilling into my back. And with every step, I felt the line between me and them burn away. The following days confirmed what I already knew. The showdown had changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just a suspicion. I was the enemy. The harassment escalated with military precision. Smear pieces started circulating online about irregularities in my service record. Reporters I'd never met were calling my phone non-stop. Fake accounts were flooding my social media with accusations. The kind of campaign only a family with deep pockets and dirtier friends could mount. Even some people on base started looking at me differently, whispering when I passed. That was the worst part. realizing their reach didn't stop at my front door. It bled into every corner of my life. But fear has a funny way of sharpening clarity. Instead of making me question myself, it only lit the fire hotter. If they were trying this hard to crush me, it meant the investigation was working. It meant their empire wasn't as untouchable as they wanted me to believe. One night, I sat alone in my apartment. Files spread across the table, notes scrolled in the margins. Evidence piled higher than ever. My phone buzzed again. It was my father. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the name on the screen until it went dark, then shoved the phone face down. They had declared war at that dinner. Fine. I knew how to fight a war. The difference was, in my war, I didn't need to hide behind lawyers, threats, or fake tears. I had the truth, and the truth was louder than all of them put together. The invitation to Christmas dinner arrived like it always did, written in my mother's neat cursive on a cream-colored card, slipped into my mailbox as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. After the showdown at the estate, I knew this wasn't just a holiday meal, it was theater. One last attempt to prove that Thomas Sinclair still controlled the script. I showed up anyway, not because I wanted to sit at their table, but because I wasn't going to let them stage their little performance without me. If they were going to play family, I was going to be there to remind them just how rotten the family had become. The Sinclair house was strung with garlands and glowing lights, the kind of picture, perfect setting you'd expect in a glossy magazine. But the shine didn't soften the edge in the air. Servants moved stiffly, their eyes flicking away from mine, as if they'd been warned not to acknowledge me. The dining room looked like it had been set for royalty. My father sat at the head, a king surveying his kingdom with my mother at his side. Daniel, Kyle, and Brooke filled their usual places. The only empty chair was mine. I slid into it without a word. Forks clinked against china. Conversation stumbled, then died. Halfway through the meal, the pretense snapped. My father set his fork down with deliberate calm, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, then pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood on marble silenced the room. He stood slowly, letting the weight of his authority fill the air. "We've come to a decision," he said, his voice steady, cold. His gaze swept the table before landing on me. "Iva, you are no longer part of this family." The words sliced through the room. My mother's eyes dropped. Brooke froze. Daniel smirked like he'd won, and Kyle leaned back with satisfaction. But I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I didn't give them the performance they expected. Instead, I felt a calmness settle over me. Steady and deliberate, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a plain envelope, and slid it across the table until it stopped in front of my father's plate. "Merry Christmas," I said, my voice even. "Consider it my parting gift." For a second, no one moved. Then my father picked it up, tore the seal, and unfolded the papers inside. His face shifted almost instantly. First confusion, then a tightening jaw, then pure unfiltered rage. Inside that envelope was a copy of the evidence packet. Documents tying his name to shell companies, falsified contracts, bank transfers routed through offshore accounts. Not rumors, not guesses, but hard proof. "What the hell is this?" His voice shook the chandelier above us. I leaned back in my chair. The truth. The kind you can't bury. He slammed the papers down, the sound echoing across crystal and silverware. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you think this makes you noble? You've destroyed everything we built." Kyle jumped in, his voice rising. "She's finished us, Dad. This is treason." Daniel sneered across the table. "You're not family. You're a soldier playing whistleblower. And soldiers don't last long when they forget the chain of command." "Oh my God." Brooke whispered over and over, tears streaking her cheeks. But none of them mattered in that moment. The only eyes I cared about were my father's. Eyes that had once watched me ride my first bike, once clapped at my school play, once told me discipline and loyalty were all that mattered. Those same eyes now burned with hatred. I didn't flinch. "You wanted loyalty. You should have earned it." His hand slammed down so hard the glasses rattled. "Get out! You're dead to me!" The room erupted. Kyle shouted. Brooke sobbed. Daniel cursed. My mother sat frozen, her hands trembling around her wine glass. The polished illusion of family shattered right there among the holiday china. I stood slowly, steady, the chaos swelling around me. My boots clicked against the marble floor as I walked out, leaving the envelope behind on the glittering table. The sound of my father's rage echoed down the hallway, but I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was suffocating in that house. I felt lighter, like the weight of pretending was finally gone. Outside, the cold air hit my face, crisp and clean. The holiday lights twinkled along the driveway, mocking the war I just walked away from. But I didn't care. The war had already begun, and I wasn't the one losing anymore. The roar of my father's voice still echoed in my ears as I gripped the steering wheel, pulling away from the Sinclair estate. My hands didn't shake, not once. The adrenaline made every motion sharper, cleaner. The streets were quiet under the glow of Christmas lights. But inside that mansion, chaos was tearing them apart, and I had lit the fuse. The fallout began before I even made it home. My phone vibrated non-stop with calls, texts, voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were reporters demanding comment. Others were anonymous threats. My apartment buzzer rang twice that night. Nobody was waiting when I checked. They wanted me scared. They wanted me rattled. They didn't understand I'd lived in fear of my father my entire life. That fear had burned away tonight at his table. By morning, the storm was everywhere. The documents from my envelope had leaked intentionally. I'd made sure copies went to the right people: investigators, regulators, journalists who'd been waiting for an opening. The headlines splashed across every major outlet by sunrise. Defense contractor Sinclair Group tied to multi-million-dollar fraud and kickback scheme. The Sinclair name, once untouchable, was now radioactive. At the base, soldiers gave me sidelong looks as I walked the corridors. Some nodded quietly, a show of respect they didn't dare voice out loud. Others avoided me altogether, afraid the scandal might stain anyone too close. Command called me into an office, stern-faced but measured. "Captain Sinclair," one colonel said, "you've stirred up one hell of a mess, but if this holds, you might have just cracked open something bigger than we imagined." That something bigger revealed itself fast. The investigation spread like wildfire. Contractors linked to Sinclair Group scrambled. Stock prices tanked. Partners cut ties. And at the center of it all, my father seethed. I knew because he made sure I heard it. Messages poured in through relatives, family, friends, even my mother, who finally broke her silence with a shaky phone call. "Ava, you don't know what you've started," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father is furious. He says this isn't just about him anymore. He says you've dragged everyone into the fire." I almost laughed. Maybe they should have thought about that before they followed him into the fire. But fury was only part of it. My father's empire was built on intimidation, and he wasn't about to change strategies now. Cars idled outside my apartment at night. Mailboxes were stuffed with threatening letters. Once I opened my door to find a dead crow on the welcome mat. Old school scare tactics. Pathetic but effective for most people. Not me, I doubled down. Every spare moment outside duty hours went to working with investigators, piecing together the full web. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, lobbying firms, bribed officials. What I'd given him at dinner was just the start. Now, with official backing, the entire rotten structure was unraveling in real time. Inside the Sinclair family, the cracks widened into chasms. Daniel's name surfaced on contracts. Kyle's voice appeared in wiretapped calls. Brooke's charitable foundation turned out to be a funnel for laundering. The public saw them as a dynasty imploding, but to me it was simply justice catching up. Still, the most dangerous part wasn't the press or the investigators. It was the rage festering in my father. One evening as I left the base, a black SUV cut me off in the parking lot. Two men stepped out, big, silent, professional. They didn't touch me, didn't say a word, just stood there blocking my path until a third figure climbed out my father. His presence was colder than the December air. He walked toward me, slow, deliberate, his eyes fixed on mine. "You've humiliated me," he said softly, almost conversational. "You've humiliated this family. Do you know what that means?" I didn't move. "It means the truth finally got louder than your lies." His lips curled, not into a smile, but something close to it. Bitter and sharp. "You think you've won. You've destroyed your blood, Ava. That's not victory. That's betrayal. And betrayal has consequences now." The men closed ranks behind him, silent muscle, ready to enforce the message. But I didn't back down. "Do what you have to do," I said, my voice steady. "But understand this? I'm not afraid of you anymore." For a long moment he just stared at me. Something flickering behind his eyes. Anger, yes, but maybe recognition, too, that the daughter he thought he owned was gone for good. Finally he turned, signaled his men, and climbed back into the SUV. The engine roared, tires squealed, and they vanished into the night. That was the last time I saw my father face to face. The storm only grew from there. Subpoenas hit the Sinclair offices, raids made the evening news, and stockholders revolted. Every channel blared with updates about the Sinclair scandal. Anchors debated whether the empire could survive. And through it all, my name kept surfacing, not as a disgraced daughter, but as the officer who exposed it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just kept moving forward, one step at a time. Because the wrath I had unleashed wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to me too. The fire was out in the open now, and none of us could put it back. The headlines didn't stop. Every morning I woke up to another front-page article, another panel of commentators dissecting the Sinclair scandal like vultures picking a carcass clean. My father had always craved the spotlight, but not like this. Not with his face plastered on every screen. Not with words like fraud, corruption, and federal investigation attached to his name. The raids came next. Federal agents stormed Sinclair Group's downtown offices at sunrise. Cameras were rolling as employees were escorted out, carrying boxes. Daniel tried to spin it as routine compliance, but nobody bought it. He was photographed shouting at agents, red-faced and sweating, the image circulating online within hours. Kyle fared no better. Recordings surfaced of his backroom deals with subcontractors, his voice dripping with arrogance as he bragged about padding margins and owning regulators. The audio was damning, undeniable. Brooks' foundation collapsed under scrutiny. Donors demanded refunds once they realized their money had been funneled into shell accounts. Overnight, her carefully cultivated image as the family philanthropist crumbled. She stopped appearing in public altogether. And my mother, she shrank into the shadows, silent and brittle, avoiding the press, avoiding me. When I finally answered one of her calls, all she said was, "It's all falling apart." Before hanging up, as if admitting it out loud was too much to bear. But the loudest collapse belonged to my father. The man who had ruled every room he entered now found himself cornered, dragged into depositions, subpoenaed for hearings. His once commanding presence was reduced to furious denials and angry outbursts caught on tape. "This is a witch hunt," he barked at reporters. "A smear campaign by bitter people who can't stand success." But the evidence piled higher than his bravado. Wire transfers, signed contracts, witnesses flipping under pressure. The net was tightening, and for the first time, Thomas Sinclair looked small. I watched from the sidelines, not celebrating, not gloating, just observing the empire crumble piece by piece. It didn't happen all at once. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The collapse wasn't clean. It dragged everyone down in different ways. Daniel's drinking worsened. He was spotted stumbling out of bars at dawn. Kyle lashed out on social media, posting rants about loyalty and betrayal before deleting them hours later. Brooke retreated completely, her name whispered in gossip columns, but her face was nowhere to be seen. And my father, he couldn't accept it. He clung to denial like a lifeline, insisting that the system was rigged against him, that enemies had conspired, that I had been brainwashed. The more the walls closed in, the more unhinged his claims became. One night, I turned on the television and saw him being escorted out of a courthouse, cuffed at the wrists. The camera lights flared, reporters shouted questions, and he bellowed over them, "This isn't justice! This is treason! My own daughter did this to me!" The words hit me harder than I expected. I knew he'd blame me. Of course he would. But hearing him say it in front of the world, spitting my name like poison, still cut deep. Yet even as the bitterness stung, there was clarity, too. He wasn't the father I remembered from childhood. What stood in the courthouse spotlight was the real Thomas Sinclair. Power-hungry, ruthless, incapable of love without strings attached. The trial dates loomed, each one promising to drag the family further into the mud. My siblings scrambled to cut deals. Lawyers whispered behind closed doors. The Sinclair dynasty was now a cage match. Every sibling was clawing to save themselves, every headline another nail in the coffin. And through it all, I felt a strange, steady calm. I hadn't won anything, not really. My career was under constant scrutiny. My personal life was shredded. Threats still arrived in the mail. But I had done what needed to be done. I had ripped the mask off. The fallout was ugly, brutal, relentless. Yet beneath the ruin, there was truth, and truth, once unleashed, didn't go back in the box. The courtroom smelled of old wood and cold coffee, a place where legacies came to die under fluorescent lights. I sat in the back, uniform pressed, shoes shined, every inch of me steady. The Sinclair name was front page news for weeks, but today it was just another case number on the docket. My father shuffled into the room in a suit that didn't fit quite right, his shoulders hunched, his jaw clenched. The swagger was gone. He glanced back once, maybe expecting to find me looking away. I didn't. Our eyes locked across the distance, and for a split second, something flickered there. Anger, regret, maybe even fear. But it passed. He sat, and the trial began. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. Contracts signed, bribes exchanged, shell companies traced. Witnesses testified, some reluctantly, others with relief. My brothers' names appeared on the screen more than once. Their deals with the government were carved out in exchange for lighter sentences. Brooks Foundation became a punchline in the press, a symbol of corruption hiding behind charity. My father's attorneys tried to spin it, painting him as a victim of political enemies, and a vengeful daughter with an agenda. They pointed at me, literally, their hands cutting through the air like knives. But the evidence didn't bend. The jury didn't flinch. When the verdict came, the room was silent. Guilty on multiple counts. The gavel struck, final and sharp. He didn't explode. He didn't collapse. He just sat there, jaw locked, eyes forward, as if refusing to give the world the satisfaction of seeing him break. The marshals led him away, chains clinking softly with each step. That was it. Decades of power, influence, and intimidation, all gone in a single word: guilty. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like hornets, microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing, questions flying. I pushed through without answering, the noise fading as soon as I stepped off the curb. For the first time in years, the air felt light. Back at the base, life carried on. Briefings, drills, paperwork stacked on my desk. Soldiers saluted in the halls, some with quiet respect, others with wary distance. I wasn't just another officer anymore. I was the one who took down her own father. Depending on who you asked, that made me a hero, a traitor, or something in between. At night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights. The threats had mostly stopped. The reporters had moved on to fresher scandals. My phone buzzed less, but the silence wasn't peace. It was space, wide and unfamiliar. Family, as I'd known it, was gone. Daniel kept drinking. Kyle disappeared into obscurity. Brooke relocated out west, pretending none of it ever happened. My mother never called again. The Sinclair family name had become a cautionary tale, whispered about in boardrooms and classrooms alike. And me? I kept my oath. I wore the uniform. I showed up because the truth was bigger than my family, bigger than the pain. I didn't do it for revenge. That word had been thrown at me over and over, like a weapon, like an excuse. But the truth was simpler. I did it because I could no longer look at myself in the mirror, knowing what I knew. Sometimes justice costs everything. Sometimes it leaves you standing alone. But standing alone with integrity will always be worth more than standing together in corruption. If there's anything left of a message in all this mess, it's this: family doesn't give you a free pass to betray your country, your duty, or your own conscience. Love without accountability isn't love, it's control. And control, no matter how strong it looks, always cracks when truth pushes hard enough. So I carry on, uniform pressed, boots laced, head held high. My name might be Sinclair, but my life, my honor, and my choices, they're mine. Looking back now, I realize the real battle was never in the courtroom, never in the headlines, and not even across the dinner table that night. The fight was always inside me, choosing between silence and truth, between loyalty and integrity. I chose the harder road, and it cost me nearly everything I once thought defined me. But stripped of the noise, the power, the family name, what's left is solid. What's left is mine. If this story resonated with you, I encourage you to share your own experiences with integrity and standing your ground. Comment below with your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of courage and truth.